Russia's main state bank has admitted that the Russian economy has fallen into recession. Just what does this mean for Putin's war machine? And is the Russian public finally going to get tired of the war? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Hit that subscribe button, and if you want access to uncensored combat footage, the kind that YouTube would never let me show you, and you want to support me and the team, bringing you independent reporting and analysis every single day of the week, become a member at combatvetnews.com. Link is in the description. So this is the big story. The Kremlin's main state bank has announced that, they think the Russian economy is officially in recession. And now this itself is not that big a deal. You can't run a war for as long as they have and expect your economy to keep pumping along hunky-dory. But what's most important is that Vladimir Putin himself has told the Russian public that he is going to do everything he can to avoid a recession. And when a dictator says this is not going to happen, the Russian state apparatus is going to work tirelessly to ensure that it doesn't, including just straight up lying. The fact that even the Kremlin cannot lie their way through this at this point is itself an incredibly troubling sign. This is coming from a chief economist at the Russian State Bank, VEB, one of Russia's largest banks, which has the status of state development corporation, financing the Kremlin's national projects. So again, this is sort of like one of those major banks, think like a Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, or Citi, the kind of banks, not like the local bank that gives you a loan for your house, but the kind of banks that give, Fortune 500 companies the loans to build huge projects or that finance huge, government projects. So according to their calculations, in the second quarter of the year, Russia's GDP fell by 0.6%. And in the first quarter, it fell by another 0.6%. So this decline for 2 quarters in a row, right, where we've seen instead of is the definition of a technical recession, which is also known as a recession. Right? In annual terms, the Russian economy remains in the black, though its growth rate has slowed to basically insignificant levels. And as they point out, in 2024, the Russian economy was booming at 4.5%. That's in spite of the massive sanctions. But that's a little bit of a lie, because the Russian economy has been essentially eaten alive by the Russian war economy. And this can actually work. Think about the U.S. economy during COVID would be a good analogy, where for a couple of months, the economy was essentially sustained by the government taking out loans and paying businesses and individuals, sending them checks basically every quarter in order to kind of float the U.S. economy and keep it going. But that we cannot simply say, oh, well, why don't we just run the economy every quarter by sending people checks? Well, obviously, that's not going to work in the long term. Just like it's like trying to pay all of your expenses on the credit card when you lose a job. You can do it for a while. And if you're careful, you can do it even sometimes for a long while. But eventually, the bills are going to catch up to you and you can no longer rob Peter to pay Paul. And that's what's happening to the Kremlin's economy, where they have been running this war footing where the state essentially taxes, takes out loans, and prints money in order to continue to spend by workers who work in weapons factories, to pay soldiers themselves and their families once those soldiers are killed, to pay transport companies to move munitions and soldiers to and from the front lines. All of this is economic activity, but it's not productive, right? It's not a good use of a worker's time to assemble, say, a Shahed drone that then is going to fly into a Ukrainian office building or hospital. That's not what a factory worker should be doing. They should be making a car that lets, for example, a baker deliver his bread faster and more efficiently, right? That's how an economy grows. Imagine, right, you would understand this intuitively if you were, for example, to have a company sponsored by the government that is essentially just, assembles widgets and then lights them on fire. You'd be like, this is a waste of money and bad for the economy in the long term. But somehow when that thing is lit on fire in a Ukrainian farmer's field, it somehow just doesn't seem to count in people's minds. But this sort of unsustainable business practice, we'll call it that, has experienced a dramatic slowdown because, well, it's not actually economically productive. In fact, Russia only grew 1.4% in the second quarter and only 1.1% in the third quarter, right? That's year-on-year economic growth has essentially stopped at 0.04%, according to the Russian Ministry of Economic Development, which means that when you're growing basically not at all it takes is just a little bit of a click over and you are in recession. And that's what's happening to the Russian government at this point. The slowdown is slowing faster and faster. And again, this is how recessions happen. And we can see it in the data, right? Russia, which everyone points out, most Western and unbiased economic analysis says that Russia is essentially a gas station. And most of its meaningful economy, I think around a third of it, is directly from the oil and gas industry, right? And you can imagine that probably 60 to 80% of the Russian economy is secondary to that, right? You're not, for example, working directly for Gazprom, but you are a company that makes the trucks that Gazprom uses. Well, you're not in the oil and gas industry, but you are. So we're talking about, I would guess and say 60% of the Russian economy is oil and gas. And how's oil and gas doing? The answer is bad. Gazprom is ostensibly making money, but its profits are down 6%. And remember, that's in not real terms, but that's in nominal terms, which means that, of course, that 6% loss of income doesn't account for the fact that the ruble itself is worth a little bit less. And so again, if inflation is 2% and your company grows its revenues at 2% a year, your company is not growing, right? You're just sort of trudging along with inflation. If your inflation rate, though, as it is in Russia, is, let's say, official state data says it's 6%, and your company is declining 6% in revenues, you're looking at about a 15% revenue decline. That is bad news for a company, right? Gazprom incurred a loss of $7 billion in 2023, following a plunge in sales to Europe. And European gas consumption has really just abandoned Russia in a lot of ways. Russian gas accounts for just 18% of European imports, down from 45% in 2021. And the region's oil imports from Russia has fallen to 3% from around 30% over that time. The European Union says it's going to phase out Russian energy by 2027. Of course, Russia has turned to China, but China itself is not really the ideal customer, and it can't really offset a highly developed country or a highly developed region like Europe. It's just not comparable. And China is unable to secure a large pipeline deal, particularly because, well, China knows that Russia is kind of in a tight spot. So they're not going to demand, they're going to ask for a discount. Like, hey, if you want us to literally save your oil and gas industry, you got to give us a good deal. And so without that, things are kind of looking tough. But that's nothing compared to how bad things are for the other major Russian oil company, Rosneft. Net income for them dropped 68% in the first half of the year. They say it's OPEC's fault, but really what's interesting is that it's essentially the United States' fault, right? Because while a lot of other OPEC countries are trying to ramp up their production, right? OPEC, has been trying to curtail production for several years to keep oil prices nice and high. This is as demand decreases. The group, which pumps about half the world's oil, reversed course and is trying to ramp up oil production, but well, the first half of the year that means that oil prices decline, right? If you increase supply, price drops. Lo and behold, economics still shows up, still applies. And so when that happens, of course, that means the oil that Russia pumps is actually sold for less and less. And for Rosneft, it's been getting kicked in the absolute teeth. And so when you have the lion's share of the Russian economy getting screwed like this, and you have nothing essentially but a war economy to rely on, well, the Russia policymakers are finding themselves between a rock and a hard place. Because remember, war requires not just raw materials and munitions purchased using the tax revenues from other economic activities, which Russia, again, doesn't have as much of because of also what's called crowding out. Essentially, if Russia needs men to go fight and die in Ukraine, every one of those men could be working. They could be working on an oil rig. They could be working on a farm. They could be generating the economic activity, paying the taxes, that then in turn fund the war effort, enable the Russian state to buy more well, war stuff. But the problem is, as we've talked about, Russia has lost something like 600,000 to 800,000 men in this conflict, either to literal death or wounded so severely that they're discharged from the army but unable to return to productive work in any way. And so for Russia, they increasingly, that is the best illustration of what's called crowding out. This is this idea that if you have this kind of large, unproductive industry within your country, it sucks up so many of the meaningful resources that other companies can't really put them to use. Again, imagine if you are a Russian oil and gas rig, and you say, listen, we just need some rough and tumble, hard-working dudes, physically strong, to run these rigs. Well, where are you going to get them? Because you're competing with the Russian military, who offers the equivalent of about $800,000 a year to these soldiers. It's going to be a tough sell. Now, obviously, some people just don't want to die, and you can always recruit from that population. But again, there's not that many able-bodied Russian men who can sign up for this kind of work. But that also applies to resources, as the Russians are finding out, right? Because if you're a Russian farmer and you say, I want to buy a new tractor, well, the problem is the steel and the engines and the rubber that should be going to making those tractors cheaper, that is getting purchased by the state and used to build tanks. And so you see how when you multiply that across numerous industries, you realize that the Russian states can't continue to run itself on a battlefield economy. More and more of the civilian economy of Russia is withering away. And as people point out, at this point, if you were to snap your fingers and Russia wins the war or ends the war, it would still have to continue this massive level of military spending because their economy would stutter, trip, and then collapse into a heap, essentially, because, well, these other industries have atrophied to a point of basic unsustainability. Again, it's hard for me to overstate how bad it is that the Russian oil and gas industry, where all you have to do is pull that shit out of the ground, right? In most other countries like Brazil, Norway, Saudi Arabia, these industries are so incredibly profitable and so stupidly easy to run that they are essentially treated as a subsidy for social programs, right? Brazil's massive anti-poverty program and its huge booming economy, right? The reason Brazil leaped over the rest of South America to become a BRICS country is because they had this massive licensing deal with the Brazilian state oil company. And they used the revenues to invest in other industries and to help their poorest citizens get access to, education and other good stuff. Right? Saudi Aramco, obviously a little bit of a different priority, used to essentially subsidize the Saudi royal family and their various wars across the Middle East. But the fact is that you have to be in such a dire strait to unprofitably run an oil and gas economy. Venezuela is another classic example where just poor economic management, poor economic stewardship just absolutely blew up their oil and gas industry and has created, again, a massive refugee crisis that's been going on for years and years. All this to say, Russia is not entering into a category of countries that are good, right? They're moving away from being a sort of oil state powering a massive foreign policy, Saudi Arabia style, and they're moving towards becoming a failed petrostate like Venezuela. Does this mean that the war in Ukraine is going to end soon? No. Right? Never underestimate the ability of a country that's really committed to continuing a war to continue on with this kind of war. And Putin's a dictator. He doesn't need popular support, right? He has total information control of his economy. He silences and arrests and sometimes kills dissenters. So this is we're not days away from the Russian war machine collapsing. But Putin also needs to stay in power, and ultimately he doesn't need the broad support of the public the way a democratic politician does, but he does need Russian oligarchs to continue to believe in his mission. But the longer this goes on, again, who do you think runs Gazprom and Rosneft? Who do you think runs Rosneft and all of these other major industries in Russia? Putin's oligarch friends. And every time one of them goes, damn, this war is going to bankrupt me. Every time they get slid down the slide and they go from being a Putin supporter to being a potential supporter of a Putinist coup. And every time that little button slides over, the more of them slide over, the more likely it is that we're going to see some kind of hard or soft coup, or the longer Putin's going to have to say, listen, there's a lot of people that could coalesce around me, and I need to make sure I need to give them some handouts to keep them happy. And that may include taking his toys and going home. But we'll see. As always, hit that subscribe button. Huge thank you to everybody that has been a supporter, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Cheers.